Back in the 12th century, a Hebrew sage by the name of Nachmanides, by studying Genesis, concluded the universe has 10 dimensions. We can only know about 4 of them. Particle physics in the 20th century have now concluded that we live in about 10 dimensions. That's a current estimate. 4 are directly measurable. 6 of them are curled less than 10 to the minus 30 centimeters, too small light, so we can only infer them indirectly. In other words, we've spent millions of dollars on atomic accelerators to learn what Nachmanides learned from studying the text of Genesis. We've been taught Euclidean geometry, 3 dimensions. But the most important lecture in mathematics ever given was June 10th of 1854, when George Riemann disclosed metric tensors. It took 60 years for them to find practical use, and that's what Einstein used for his theory of relativity when he recognized that we live in not 3 but 4 dimensions. And so in Ephesians chapter 3, Paul tells us that, by the way, if you're watching for it. Ephesians 3:17, that Christ may dwell in your hearts by faith, that ye being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all saints what is that breadth, length, and depth, and height, to know the love of Christ which passes knowledge, that ye might be filled with all the fullness of God. The point is breadth, length, depth, and height. 4 dimensions. Most of what we know about the creation is post-curse, because we all know about Genesis 3. History as we know it started after that curse. We had the flood of Noah, for among other things, that have increased the entropy, decreased the order, if you will. Now, entropy is called the bondage of decay in Romans 8:21. There are many of us that believe it was introduced as part of the curse. The universe was fractured, separated from 4 to 6 dimensions is one speculation. And at that curse, we have the physical universe, which we can directly access, but the other 6 dimensions are not accessible to us now. And we call that the spiritual universe, or I would call it the metacosm, if you will.
It was in 2009, I think, when they published this, that they found sprawling clouds of cold water vapor around a burgeoning solar system. But they've actually been telling us that there's water all around our whole solar system, isn't it? Our entire solar system is surrounded by water in the form of ice. Firstly, we have the Kuiper Belt, and then that is within another big cloud of water or ice called the Oort cloud. So you get the Kuiper Belt, and then the Kuiper Belt and the entire solar system sits in the Oort cloud that surrounds the entire solar system. So they tell us that this solar system called Hydra is surrounded by water, and then actually our entire solar system is surrounded by water, and it looks probably something like this. The entire thing is possibly made up of water. And suddenly, I have a very different take on the opening statement of the Bible. The Spirit of God moved over the waters.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light. And there was light.
I could never understand that. What does that mean? How come there's water? Nothing has been created. He hasn't even said, let there be light, and yet there's already water. So suddenly Scripture takes on a very different kind of meaning to me.
Take a look at Genesis 1, because that's really the subject here. God said, let there be light, and there was light, and God saw the light, and that it was good. God divided the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were day 1. The word evening, it comes from the word erev. That came to mean eve, but that wasn't the original concept behind it. And the other word is boker, which is, now they use it for morning. Why do they do that? Because neither of these, by the way, will show up on day 7. Did it not have an evening and morning? Of course it did. But what the words are focusing is on a prior, more pervasive meaning. Let's take a look at an entropy profile of the universe. I'm putting entropy at the bottom of the chart and order at the top. In other words, entropy is maximum at the bottom and order is maximum at the top. Are you with me so far? Day 1, we have Erev and Boker, which is a reduction of entropy or an increase in order, okay? Erev means disorder or obscurity. And at night, things are dark and obscure. And that word also becomes meaning for night, but it had a prior, it's a pun, but it's the prior meaning is Erev. Boker is discernible order. We're going from disorder to order, going from Erev to Boker. And that comes to mean morning and evening, but that is a pun, if you will, of a deeper meaning, if I may. Now, on that first day, God makes his first direct quote in the Bible, "Let light be." And let's take a look at, as we study the very nature of light. Boy, we could spend a whole hour talking about that. But most of you realize that every particle has an antiparticle, and when an antiparticle hits a positive particle, they annihilate each other and give off a photon, give off light. But another way of saying that is if I reverse the entropy, that shows how light can create a symmetrical set of particles out of nothing. And that's the mechanism we find in day one. But let's move to day two. From Erev to Boker, there's another step of creation, and that's creating the atoms and the molecules. Let's talk about an atom, because this is a grasp you really need to get. We've all in school made little diagrams, and I'm using hydrogen, one of the simple ones. We have a nucleus and an electron going around it. This is not the scale, but I'm going to try to communicate the scale to you if I can. We know that the atom is about 10 to the minus 8 centimeters in size. The nucleus is about 10 to the minus 13. The numbers aren't important, but the ratio is. What we're saying here is that it takes 100,000 that distance to make the orbit of the electron. 100,000. The ratio between the two is 10 to the fifth, 100,000. Well, if that's the linear distance, the area would be that squared, right? So that would be 10 to the 10th. The volume would be that number cubed. You with me so far? How many follow that? So that's the 10 to the 15th number is a staggering number. And I remember I was on a board with Dr. Teller, and they were using a 10 to the 15th number, and I said, wow, that's more than there are seconds in 30 million years. And they looked at me shocked. They use those numbers, but they didn't have a personal grasp of what they mean. See, 10 to the 15th is the same ratio as 1 second has to 30 million years. See, when I say it that way, you get a feeling for what 10 to the 15th is. If I say this podium is solid, and you'd say, no, Chuck, there's nothing here, you're more right than I am by a ratio of 1 second to 30 million years. This is an electrical simulation. It feels solid because the molecules of my hand are colliding with the molecules of the... So it feels solid. That's an electrical illusion. It's a virtual thing. We're going to get into that, believe it or not.
Here is a picture of an electron. There's a picture taken about a decade ago. They tell us that this is a light beam or electron riding a light beam. Can you see a particle anywhere in this picture? No, there's no particle. They're resonant waves, and yet they tell us it's an electron. Can you see how we get brainwashed? So this is what Nikola Tesla has to say about the electron from an interview in 1928. On the whole subject of matter, in fact, Dr. Tesla holds the view that are startlingly original. He disagrees with the concept of atomic theory of matter and does not believe in the existence of an electron as pictured by science. This is a shock to the system. And you start seeing an agenda being developed here, an agenda being developed by mainstream universities, the mainstream scientific fraternity, under the guidance of those that are trying to lie to us and make us believe things that are not so.
We're learning that space is not empty. It has permittivity, it has permeability. As any radio ham will tell you, it has intrinsic impedance. When you tune an antenna for transmission, you're trying to match the impedance to the impedance of space. Velocity of light, of course, has been slowing down. That's a whole other story. But the zero-point energy, most physicists will tell you that's just a mathematical concept. No, there's a surprise coming. They've now discovered that the zero-point energy is measurable, it's staggering, and it's revising our whole perception of subatomic particles. So that it happens as you get into that and really understand the fabric space, the arguments fall into our lap. If the temperature of an empty container is lowered to absolute zero, there remains a residual amount of thermal energy that cannot by any means be removed. It's called the zero-point energy. A vacuum is now known to be a vast reservoir of seething energy of which particles being formed and annihilated constantly. Why does the electron in an atom not radiate itself out and collapse? Why doesn't that happen? because it's made up by the zero-point energy replaces it. And that's exactly what Paul tells you in 1 Colossians 1, by the way.
This is what Einstein has to say about electrons. In the theoretical treatment of these electrons, we are faced with the difficulty that electrodynamic theory itself is unable to give an account of their nature. For since electrical masses constituting the electron would necessarily be scattered under the influence of their mutual repulsion unless there are forces of another kind operating between them, the nature of which has hitherto remained obscure to us. So he says he doesn't quite understand how electrons come into being.
We're just getting warmed up. We're going to day 3 already. And there we have the land and the oceans and so forth. Just take one thing off the earth, take a leaf off a tree, and you discover it's more complicated than most of us can possibly understand. In fact, not only that leaf itself, but its place in the cycle. The plants give off the oxygen and the sugar, and the animals need that, and they give off the CO2, which the plants need. And this whole model is in balance. That not only means it was created, it means it's being maintained. They always say 1% change in the ozone is going to bring cosmic disaster. You've heard that from your greenies, right? Well, if that's true, who balanced it so delicately in the first place? See, that argument that it's rare is an argument for creation, not the accident of design.
So you see, all of the characteristics of laws of mathematics make sense in light of the fact that mathematics stems from the mind. Laws of mathematics would have to be conceptual because God's thoughts are conceptual. That makes sense. Laws of mathematics are universal. They apply everywhere because God is omnipresent. Right? Laws of mathematics are invariant because God doesn't change with time. God's beyond time and made time. Laws of mathematics are exceptionalist because God is sovereign. There's no aspect of creation that is out of his control. I guarantee you, all astronomers, at least all the ones I've ever met in my career, all believe that mathematics works the same way in the Andromeda Galaxy as it works here on Earth. And you couldn't know anything about the Andromeda Galaxy if you didn't assume that. You assume the laws of physics are the same there. You assume the laws of mathematics are the same there. How do they know that? Have they been there? Of course not.
Let's go to day 4. Adrian Boker, we come to what we call our solar system. Bear with me on this model because I think this is one of the things you'll want to take away in your notes. Robert Burnham publishes a celestial almanac, and in that he has a chapter that's too provocative to pass. He takes advantage of a coincidence. The number of inches in a statute mile is 63,360. Okay. It turns out that, the basic unit in astronomy is the distance from the Earth to the Sun. That's called an astronomical unit. It happens, mile is roughly 63,300. The number of astronomical units in a light year is roughly the same number into 0.1% difference. So that's a convenient way to make a model. If we're going to make a model here of the universe, we can use that ratio and carry it out. In Burnham's model, 1 inch represents the distance of the sun to the Earth. 1 mile represents a light year. You with me so far? Well, the sun is about 9,000ths of an inch. Let's call it 100th of an inch. All planets will turn out to be lying within a 1 meter circle. The Earth will be 1 inch away from the sun by definition. Mercury and Venus, 4/10 or 7/10 radius. Mars about 1.6 inches. Jupiter about 5 inches. Saturn about 9.5. Uranus about 19.2. Neptune 30.0. Pluto, 39.5 inches. In other words, if we're building this model, we have a period, the center at the sun, and the entire model would be within a radius of 1 meter. So if we're doing it, we can sort of visualize that. That's important. Well, the nearest star is Alpha Centauri, 4.5 light years away. Okay, so we need a speck. It's about the same size as our sun, so it's a speck about the size of a period that we've got to not only place 4.5 miles away in our model. How much influence would gravity have? 2 specks of dust, 4.5 miles away, when you're supposed to square the distance between them. In other words, it's worse than that. By the way, the Milky Way would be 100,000 miles in radius. If you look at your equation of gravitation, it has a denominator of the distance squared. In other words, whatever the distance is, you got to square that in the denominator, which means the further away they are, it disappears into being meaningless. See, the plasma physicists have been trying to tell that to us for several decades. The astronomers aren't listening. They haven't done the math. If you take a look at your fundamental forces from your textbooks, you'll discover that gravity is 10 to the minus 38, electromagnetic 10 to the minus 2. In other words, electromagnetics outperform gravity by 10 with 36 zeros after it. Not 36,000 times, 36 umptiums, whatever you're going to call. And by the way, the electric pushes and pulls. Gravity doesn't. So the real point is, the minute you go beyond our solar system and look at the sky, the galaxies, gravity is a non-player. And what's astonishing, there are bright mathematicians spinning all kinds of theories that make no sense because they haven't done the math. 99.9% of the mass of the universe is not solid. It's not solid, liquid, or gas. It's plasma. It is ionized gas. The plasma pioneers have been trying to tell us that. They can create the same shapes in the laboratory using Maxwell equations, not gravity. Let's go one step further. We then have the birds, and we have this whole business of the death of Darwinism. The thing that put the nails in Darwin's coffin was, of course, microbiology. Advances in microbiology, the DNA and so forth, have dealt the death blow to Darwinism. The DNA happens to be, we discover, a 3 out of 4 error-correcting code. Darwinism cannot explain the origin of life because it cannot explain the origin of information. Irreducible complexity that Michael B. introduces definitely just renders chance or randomness, refutes that as a possible designer. And you can get into that on your own. But let's take 6. You've always heard the 6 is the number of man. How many have heard that? Biblically, well, it's a little more than that. We go on the 6th day, and I'm going to use Da Vinci's Vitruvian of Man as a symbol of man and his reach, if you will. 6 is the number of man we hear. It turns out, I read this and I didn't believe it. I thought it was some Christian contrivance. I checked it out. It turns out to be true. At a cellular level, an intact human immune system will virtually always recognize and reject a non-human transplant as foreign. How? On virtually every nucleated cell in a person are small markers, lipoproteins to be precise, called antigens. Their official designation is the histocompatibility antigen or human leukocyte antigen. HLA is the common thing. And it turns out certain antigens are the same in every human and are only found in humans, although given individuals may have different arrangements and collections of these molecules. The irony is that every person, on virtually every cell in that person, this marker mankind's product, and it's a product of one certain chromosome. Its chromosome, guess which number? 6. I'm going to use the symbol of man to represent the reach of man. If I'm going to focus on things larger than man, I'll call that collectively the macrocosm. And the 4th dimension of time, of course, is in that subject. It had a beginning. The big discovery of 20th century science is that the universe is finite, not infinite. It may be expanding, but it's finite, not infinite. That's the problem. That means it had a beginning, and that's why they have these speculations called the Big Bang models. But the fact that it's finite is a key fact. Let's go the other way. Let's go things that are smaller, man. Let's start up what we call the microcosm. We discover that in subatomic particles, there's a limit to smallness. That's why we're spending tens of billions of dollars on the Hadron Colliders to try to learn more about smallness. It turns out there's a limit to smallness. It's called the Planck wall, if you will. Indivisible units. Planck limits for length, mass, energy, and time. You would think if I take a piece of string and cut it in half, I can throw the half away and do it again. You think, I could do that forever. I might get so small I couldn't handle it, but conceptually I could always figure whatever I got I can cut in half. I discovered that's not true. When it gets 10 to the minus 33 centimeter and I try to cut it in half, it loses a property that the physicists call locality. There's a property called non-locality. That thing is provably everywhere in the universe at one time, and that's been proven in the laboratory, by the way. So that's not just a theory anymore. And we now don't think of 3 or 4 dimensions. We know we live in at least 10. That's the current estimate. But the key point that you want to understand the implications of is that both the macrocosm has a finite and is of largeness, and there's a finite limit to smallness. That has staggering implications in our understanding of reality. We live in a finite, digital, simulated universe. It's a virtual digital environment that we find ourselves in. Now, this is not my conclusion. This is the words of Scientific American, June of 2005, where they conclude that our universe is but a shadow of a larger reality. That's their words, not mine. And when I first read that, it blew me away, because that's exactly what the Bible has been saying all along in John 1, Hebrews 1, on and on. That larger reality, our reality is in a larger context. For lack of another term, I'll call it the metacosm. That's the domain of the angels. That's the domain, apparently, of the UFOs. There's a region that is a transfer function in and out of our finite simulation that we call our physical reality. This is all provable. This isn't theoretical. This is provable stuff. Genesis 3, the shining one, the forbidden fruit, you all know the story. The doubt and then the denial that Satan created that resulted in God's declaration of war, in which the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent are the two contestants, if you will, in a sense. And the seed of the woman being a title of Christ, and the seed of the serpent is one who is yet to make his appearance. You are both the pawns and the prize in that warfare. And that's why we're here together on this thing. Why right now? I'm going to put something on the screen which, if you accept, you flunk the course. I want you to challenge. I'm putting it up on sincerely, but I want you to challenge it. I believe that you and I are being plunged into a period of time about which the Bible says more than it does about any other period of time in history. The more you know about the classic biblical scenario and the pending turmoil amidst the current geopolitical tensions every day that are increasing, the more you will recognize that we are indeed plunging into what's called in the scripture the end times. You can prove it. And the encroaching darkness is making all of us increasingly politically incorrect. To be a biblical Christian is going to be increasingly a life-threatening posture you're going to have. And as J. Vernon McGee and others predicted, the attack against the biblical Christian will come from the denominational churches. And that's a shock, but you can find it documented by E.H. Broadbent in his book, The Pilgrim Church. Are you prepared for that? Even correct science won't help you. Only a personal relationship with the designer himself will help you. Do you know him? That's the question of the day. Search the scriptures, you're challenged by him, and he takes the commitment that you will know. He will assume the responsibility to reveal himself to you.